Hello, my name is Ian, and I am a tutor here at Chegg. Today we are going to be talking about the Phillips curve. There are two types of Phillips curves, the short run and the long run. Before we can move on to the long run, we need to understand what is happening in the short run. So I'll show you a graph in a moment, but the short run Phillips curve is the negative short run relationship share between inflation and unemployment. This concept is very similar to something you studied in micro, so I'm going to explain that to help you understand the short run Phillips curve. So this curve right here, this orange line labeled SRPC, short run Phillips curve, this is what a typical Phillips curve looks like. To me, it reminds me of demand, which you may have studied in, or I would hope you had studied in micro. If you remember how demand worked, this short-run Phillips curve works in the same way, except it's in a different application. So if you have a high inflation rate, you'll have a low unemployment rate. So that means more people will be employed in the economy. And if you have a high unemployment rate, then you'll have a low inflation rate. This is similar to demand because if we change the inflation rate to price and unemployment to quantity, if you have a higher price, people will demand a smaller quantity. But if you have a smaller or lower price, people will demand a higher quantity. So it's the same idea, just a different curve. And you may see that this line here, this is to represent deflation, which I won't be covering in this particular video, but essentially it is the exact opposite of inflation. It's decreasing prices instead of a gradual increase in prices. So that's great. We know, as the definition stated, that there's a negative short-run relationship between inflation and unemployment. How do I apply this? That doesn't mean much to me. So let's pretend that the unemployment, or not the unemployment, but people expect the inflation rate to increase by 4%. Since there's no labels on this graph, I'm just going to draw a line. If it's an expected increase in inflation, the line will always go above the original one. And this distance here, this distance between SRPC and our new blue line here, this distance equals 4%. And it will always equal whatever the increase is. So if this increase had been 10%, 3%, 0.5%, that is how much it will have moved up. If the economy is expecting a deflation, because this is something your professor may ask you, you will do something very similar, but in the opposite direction. So again, the exact amount it's decreasing doesn't necessarily matter. But if we are decreasing or have an expected deflation of 1%, that is equal to the distance here. It could be 0.5%, 10%, any percent you can think of for a decrease or an increase. That is always how much the short run Phillips curve will change. So let's try an example. For the following year, there is expected to be a 2% increase in inflation. How will the short run Phillips curve 0 shift? So as this stands right now, we can see that the unemployment rate is at 5%, and therefore the inflation rate is 0. We want it to shift up 2% due to the fact it has increased. If it said decrease, we would be doing the opposite of what we are doing now. So we can see 2% is here. So we want our curve to move up to here, and I'm making this line more for a reference for myself to draw this more accurately for you guys. We want it to shift 2%. So that means we'll make a new line that will go from 5 and cross through 2. And again, just to make sure I don't mess up the scaling of this, I'm going to draw another reference line for myself. I apologize for that part, but I just want to make it clear where exactly I'm going with everything. So it will pass through that point. And you will have a 2% increase. That's how much this is between SRPC 0, and I would label this SRPC 2. Or some professors would want you to do SRPC 1. So that's what I will do. But the most important thing to remember here is we increased by 2% upwards by 2%. So we went from 0 to 2. So we now know that at a 5% rate of unemployment, for the next short-run Phillips curve, we will have a 2% inflation rate. If we were to increase by 2% again, we would then go to 4% and so on. So again, it would be the same if there is just a decrease. You would just go the opposite direction. So what's the long run Phillips curve now? It's the relationship between unemployment and inflation after the expectations of inflation have adjusted from experience. And something I am going to mention in conjunction with the long-run Phillips curve is the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, often shortened to NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U. It is the unemployment rate where inflation does not change over time. Okay, what the heck does that mean? So, try not to get lost in this graph here. Don't panic. It's fine. I will explain everything that is happening here. So this first line, SRPC0, is just like our first line here, SRPC0. That is our starting point. Then there was a 1% increase in inflation. So we went from SRPC0 to SRPC2, as you can see from this line here. So we went from 6% at a stable, we went from 6% with a 0% inflation to a 6% with a 1% inflation. So, or 2% inflation rather. So this is our 2. So that was our increase there. And then we increased by 2 again from SRPC2 to SRPC3. So at 6% unemployment for our first short run Phillips curve, we have 0. Then your professor asks you, we have a 2% increase in inflation. What do? We shift the curve up by 2%. This gives us SRPC2. This now means at the same unemployment rate, 6%, there will be a 2% unemployment or inflation rate. And then your professor asks you again, there's an expected inflation rate of 2% once more. What do? You shift SRPC2 to SRPC3. So you increase again by 2%. And at the same inflation rate at 6%, you will meet a 5% inflation, or 4% inflation rate, pardon me. So you're probably wondering what exactly this line here is going to show. And you're probably also wondering what the, orange line between all the equilibrium points is. That is the long run Phillips curve. So let's say the US government, the government of Germany, or the United Kingdom, anywhere you can think of, they decide they want a 4% unemployment rate. Different than the 6% unemployment rate because it's on a different place along the x-axis. That means initially on your short run Phillips curve 0, they will have a 2% inflation rate. And then if we had started here instead of 6, your professor asks you, there's a 2% increase or expected increase in inflation rate the following year. What do? Same shift of 2% upwards, except now at 4%, you have a 4% inflation rate. 4% unemployment means 4% inflation rate. And then at point C here, it's not labeled on the graph, but you will end up having 6% because we still have that 2% difference. So this goes back to that relationship we spoke of before. If you want a lower unemployment rate, you're going to have to face a higher inflation rate. So 4% unemployment for SRPC 0, you're going to have to face 2% inflation. For 6% unemployment, you're going to face 0% inflation for SRPC 0. And then the same idea applies to SRPC 2 and SRPC 3. So the long run Phillips curve is this orange vertical line that I also have labeled NAIRU, which you may remember stands for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is the unemployment rate where inflation does not change over time. So in a micro class you took, you learned about elasticity. This is bringing it back. So I had a special way to remember elasticity, but I'm only going to bring up the perfectly inelastic one here, because that is exactly what the long run Phillips curve is. If something is perfectly inelastic, it is vertical. It's like a tree. It can move in less than one direction. So since it's inelastic, what does that mean? That means the price effect, if it were a demand or supply curve, is greater than the quantity effect. So similar to our application of demand in the previous example, we can apply it here as well. That means no matter what the change in price may be, or in this case, the change of inflation rate, the unemployment rate in this case, or the quantity demanded in the original case for demand curves, you will always have the same rate of unemployment. So I'll repeat that again without the example in it. No matter the inflation rate, you will always have the same unemployment rate for the long run Phillips curve. That's why it does not move, and it goes through equilibrium 1, equilibrium 2, and equilibrium 3. So that goes back to the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. The unemployment rate where inflation does not change over time. So the unemployment rate between time period SRPC 0 to SRPC 3, it stays at 6. That's how we know it is the non-accelerating inflation rate. Whenever you have a vertical point, that is how you will know. Whenever I took exams, my professors always provided us with the graph, But in the event your professor does not provide you with a graph and they just start with SRPC 0 and they ask you 2% inflation rate for SRPC 2, then you will increase it by 2%. And then you do the same for SRPC 3. Wherever the inflation rate doesn't change, assuming that he, she, or they may ask for the long-run Phillips curve, that is where you will put your long-run Phillips curve. Usually there will be a way to calculate that, but if you're in a intro course, which is likely what you will first be seeing this in, you will only be asked to apply it in an example like here. So to go over everything one last time, the short-run Phillips curve is the negative relationship between inflation rate and unemployment. So higher inflation rate, lower unemployment. Higher unemployment, lower inflation rate. The long-run Phillips curve is a curve that represents the fact over the long run, inflation rates and unemployment, the perfect point is NIRU, which is also your long-run Phillips curve, because inflation rate does not affect the unemployment